Good morning, everyone, and I'm delighted to be here to talk about the topic of exposure. And it's a really interesting topic to me in cybersecurity. I see it as one of the kind of big domains of cyber that maybe hasn't been thought about holistically, but the market is catching up to this concept of exposure is a really important aspect to consider when you are managing your security. And exposure is something we face in our everyday lives. It's not just a work thing. It's not just for your organizations. So even a simple example like too much exposure, and you could end up like the roast chicken in this cartoon. Um, so what I'm going to just talk about is just talk about what is exposure, and the different types of exposure that are out there, and then how the attackers leverage exposure to achieve their goals, because that's really important to understand in order to be able to understand how to manage and mitigate it. I'm going to talk about this emerging idea of threat exposure management and how to manage that in a holistic manner, and then hopefully leave you with a few thoughts to take away with you that you can use when you go back into your work environments. It's actually quite simple. An exposure is anything that a bad actor could exploit to achieve their objectives. And I think when you open up the idea that it doesn't really matter what it is, if it can be exploited as part of an attack, then it's effectively an exposure that needs to be somehow understood and managed or mitigated. And there are a number of trends exacerbating the exposure within attack surfaces and the expanding attack surfaces. So we're well into the work from anywhere era. As this just I saw this in a magazine, I thought it was quite funny. Um, the interview panel, and there's the remote interviewee saying, being asked politely if there's any chance they might occasionally want to come into the office or not. Um, but that whole expansion of the attack surface, because of the fact that people are working from anywhere, from any environment, using all sorts of different devices, accessing all sorts of different applications, kind of very often not even on your own, within your own environment. The move to the cloud, as Rich mentioned, continues, and in spite of the fact that this is a trend that's been going on for a long, long time, it is true that not everybody is still fully up to speed in how to do that and how to do that securely, and what are the exposures in the cloud that we're leaving. And the problem is that the cloud has huge benefits, but it also has, it, it, it basically, if done insecurely, can open you up to massive exposures because of the fact you've centralized a lot of information, data, and applications that can be accessible from anywhere. And that's not to mention other trends like massive rise in IoT connected devices being used in every organization, 30 billion by 2027, massive annual growth in investment in OT type systems, which again is becoming more and more of a attack vector that we're seeing in the market. And data is still continuing to explode. So 90% of data is unstructured. So that's an attack surface as well, because obviously your most sensitive data, if left unsecure, can leave you very open to attack. So lots of trends pushing in this direction. So Rich talked about the security first model, and I do believe exposure is one of the big domains of cybersecurity thinking, and there's a bit of a dance going on between exposure and protection and detection and response. And as organizations, as cyber security leaders and professionals, we have to consider these different aspects. I've talked about the expanding attack surface around cloud, SaaS, on-prem, data, OT, work from anywhere, identities and permissions. This is the new modern enterprise in all its glory from an attack surface perspective. And of course, we do our best to wrap a protective layer around that. We block things, we put in endpoint protection, we put in firewalls, we put in other type of protective controls to try and prevent as much as possible. And then, of course, we always say that no protection is 100% secure, so you need to have detection and response within your environment in order to see what has, got through your protective controls so you can actually take action. And then I think where exposure fits in is those little gaps in your protection that can be leveraged to get through your protective layers and get in at the attack surface. And often will be picked up potentially by your detection and response, but often clever threat actors can bypass and find ways around detection and response depending on your level of exposure. So this is this kind of dance going on between the protective layer, the exposure, and then detection and response that needs to be part of the holistic thinking in cybersecurity. Now, vulnerability management is traditionally the big, exposure that most organizations worry about, and it is a very foundational layer for exposure management. However, it's a problem that's not going away. The number of CVEs coming out every year is growing, and in recent years appears to be growing at even a more rapid rate. And many organizations struggle to deal with this. How do we deal with this ever-increasing number of CVEs in my environment? So I want to pause there and just do a quick poll to ask the audience how many people in the audience are relatively happy with their vulnerability management capability and processes within their environment. So if you're happy enough, could you raise your hand, and so I can get to a straw poll within the environment. Okay. So. And to be honest with you, nobody, even if you are relatively comfortable, you're probably not going to put up your hand and then, because nobody is, being a good security leader is you're never rest on your laurels and be comfortable. But I think by evidence of the fact that pretty much nobody said yes there, kind of implies that this problem does exist and is not going away. And then there are concepts like risk-based vulnerability management that the likes of Gartner have introduced to help organizations figure out, well, what's everything out there and how do I prioritize? Because obviously you want to fix the most important things, the things with the greatest risk, fix them first. So it's a cyclical process where you're constantly assessing across different domains, you're prioritizing based on a lot of different information, and then you're compensating, whether it's patching or compensating controls or whatever it might be. So poll number 2 then, who in the organization has implemented a risk-based vulnerability management within their environment? Okay, yeah. So fair few. I mean, still the minority, but there are a lot of people here who have implemented that within their environment, and that is considered very, very good practice. So the thing about exposure management now, this whole new concept of exposure management, even taking a risk-based vulnerability management approach might not be sufficient, and also fixing every vulnerability is pretty much infeasible. Realistically, because nobody has the resource or capacity, and also the business impact of fixing different types of vulnerabilities can also be very, very challenging. So types of exposures then, unfortunately I'm going to kind of make things worse before they get better. So we're already seeing a big problem with vulnerabilities. Well, unfortunately that's only one type of exposure, because if you think about that definition I talked about at the start. So what a threat actor can leverage in order to achieve their objectives. You have vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, identities and permissions. Are people, have they got excessive permissions? Have they got access to things they shouldn't have access to? All these types of things can be exploited. Are there cached credentials lying around within the environment that can be exploited? I often hear that popping up in terms of attacks, both on the IR side and also on the red teaming side. Security controls. You might think you have the best controls and technologies in place, but that EDR platform that you install on that device, is it actually running or did it fall over and nobody noticed? Misuse of SaaS. Even your people, the awareness of people, that's an exposure. You find that phishing on social engineering is leveraged in a massive percentage of attacks. So adopting this mindset of thinking about exposures holistically has to bring the human element also into the equation. And your physical security, if someone can wander in and plug in a device or look over someone's shoulder, that's an exposure. Your supply chain, the amount of organizations, there's no organization out there now not using third parties in some shape or fashion. Credentials, and now AI as well being talked, that can be thought of as well as an exposure, which I'll get onto in a moment. Which leads me on to because there's all these different exposures to think of, it leads me on to the statement that security leaders must become CEOs. And then, you're probably thinking, yeah, I'm ambitious, but next step probably will be, to try and take the top job. But what I really mean by that is chief exposure officers. So security people must be the people within their organization who are thinking about exposures holistically and understanding what are the exposures we have, which are the important ones, how do they leave us vulnerable, and what should we do about it. And one example, there's loads of different examples of applying this mindset, but because one of the topics of the conference is AI, I'll give an example in AI, and I think no presentation is complete without a good meme. So this is a classic meme. Is AI a threat or an opportunity? So you can see here where the security leader being a little bit shocked about the interest of the business in all of the productivity gains, potentially that can be leveraged from AI. And then applying the CEO mindset, the Chief Exposure Officer mindset to AI. AI does create new exposures because there could be unauthorized access. If you provide an AI, natural language interface into your environment to your people, first of all, can they access information that they shouldn't have access to? Because the large language model has learned on data that gave them permission to see those things. Impact of a breach can be really magnified because now no longer potentially is it, does it have to be only a privileged user, but now a threat actor who gains access to somebody who has an AI capability within the environment suddenly can very, very quickly with natural language queries gain access to a tremendous amount of information and inform their further travels within your organization. Information governance, data classification and labeling, and access permissions all come into play in order to try and manage that. AI turbocharges exposure exploitation. So, Rich alluded to the advent coming now of how AI is going to be leveraged by the bad guys. So, advanced phishing at scale, the deep fakes and social engineering gets turbocharged by some of the AI capabilities, and AI attack automation can help as well. But on the positive side, AI will also bring opportunities to mitigate exposure. So just being able to query your environment and ask the AI, what exposures do I have, and how can I mitigate them, and which are the most severe, and which are the most exploited in the wild, and all those capabilities are coming. So AI enhanced tooling, the co-pilotization of the SOC to really help and boost your SOC analysts in terms of what they can see and what they can do quickly, and organizing all of your security data so you can train those models in order to help your security. And the thing is that attackers don't just leverage typically one exposure and then they're done, they chain exposures and build attack paths. And we have the MITRE attack framework that talks about all the different tactics that are used by threat actors and all of the techniques underneath that they can use to achieve those tactics, to achieve their gains. So when thinking about exposures, you really need to think about your exposures holistically and not just individually in terms of, is this a good or a bad exposure, is this a good or bad exposure, but how those might be chained together in an attack. So, and the fact of the matter is that requires a good understanding of your attack surface. And unfortunately, most organizations don't actually understand their attack surface. So you do need, in order to manage exposures, you need to understand the attack surface in its entirety, what are the exposures and the possible attack paths. You need to constantly be monitoring that, because that can change day to day, hour to hour, just based on simple misconfigurations or whatever. And choking off attack paths can be a really strong way to reduce risks, because if you understand all the attack paths to get to your critical assets, then that can really help in prioritizing what you need to do. Because the fact is, it's, exposure management, even vulnerability management, which being a subset of exposure management, it seems like a continuous game of whack-a-mole. And we need to figure out how to prioritize the remediation of the exposures, not just within each domain, but across them as well. And if we take the, formulae from risk management, typically your simple formula is risk equals probability times impact. So that can actually give you a clue as to how to think about both the probability of exploitation. So the probability can be driven by factors like, how easy is it to leverage this exposure? Is it being actively exploited in the wild? Are threat actors who use that exposure targeting my specific industry and geography and things like that? But then also the impact, and the impact being, yes, is it a critical asset, but also it could be an internal asset, but it's at a nexus within your environment that could be on a critical path to your crown jewels. So therefore, it becomes the impact of that exposure being leveraged is really, really, really increased, and therefore should go up the priority scale. So asset criticality alone is not enough to be able to prioritize and determine the priority of a remediation. And I've heard it said, oh well, it's not an interface, it's not an externally facing asset, so we're not as worried about that asset in terms of its vulnerabilities, which might be the case if it's nicely segmented off and it doesn't get the threat actor anywhere or access to anything. But just relying purely on asset criticality is definitely not enough to think about. And just an example of maybe focusing on the wrong things. Again, stepping back a little bit from the cyber world, and we've often heard the expression, it's like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. So if you think about these guys here, worrying about the deck chairs on the Titanic, then you can see the iceberg being the looming threat, and one of the exposures that the staff are worried about, the officers are worried about, is the deck chairs. However, there was a much more significant exposure, which was an assumption was made that the ship's hull can never be breached, that there was a number of compartments at the front of the ship, and 4 of them could be breached, and even then the ship wouldn't sink. But the bulkheads behind those, the front of the ship, were below the waterline, or were not sufficiently above the waterline. So once that invalid breach assumption occurred, and in fact 6 of those forward compartments were breached, it meant more water got in, and literally the water just went over the top of each bulkhead in sequence, almost like a threat actor traversing your environment, until finally, tragically, the ship sank. And on top of that, thinking about the impact of an incident, there was a completely inadequate response plan. There was only 20 lifeboats with places for 1,178 people, and there was actually over 2,200 people on board, and there was a lot of confusion about instant response and how to, what were the rules around women and children only or women and children first. So a lot of only 60% of the lifeboat places were actually ended up being used because of confusion around how to respond. So I guess the parallels to be drawn with exposure management is around thinking about what's the priority of your exposures and the impact of those exposures being leveraged, and also having response and not making some invalid breach assumptions that think you're safe when in fact you could have a significant impact beyond that. So what are the components of exposure management? Well, it's your foundational management of vulnerabilities. So it is around asset discovery, scanning, classification, exploitability, prioritization, and mitigation. But threat exposure management really brings in managing the entire attack surface. So understanding the full attack surface externally from the attacker's perspective. Understanding the full cyber asset attack surface, so not just the external, but your entire attack surface, which includes all of your internal assets, and not just IT, but OT, IoT, and anything else in your environment. Understanding the attack paths, so what are those choke points you should be targeting in your remediation? What's your posture in the cloud as well? Because the cloud now is integral with general IT. So what's your posture and configuration in the cloud? Even external to your whole environment, your digital risk. Do you have leaked credentials on the open, deep, or dark web? Does somebody have a phishing, has a typo squatting domain set up to target your customers or your employees, so that they will give up credentials, and therefore that could be an exposure as well. Your supply chain, your people, all of that list that I provided earlier. And then the third pillar of threat exposure management is that you can't just occasionally check in to test your exposures. That should really be a continuous process, and there are emerging and quite common practices for how to do that on an ongoing basis around continuous pen testing, breach and attack simulation, security controls, validation, and things like that. So that becomes a continuous loop, that you're never just assuming that you're completely covered. And threat exposure management is one of the rising areas of security operations. If I look at the hype cycle for security operations, everything circled in red there, almost everything that's the new wave that's coming relates in one way or another to threat exposure management. So I kind of see it as a kind of a collective awakening, if you like, of the industry to this idea of managing exposures more holistically. And then the idea of continuous threat exposure management is a program that can be set up within an organization in order to take an attacker's view, but also then look holistically around the scope of what's needed in order to fully manage your exposures across your business, and sitting within those other areas around threat detection and response, and also security posture optimization and continuous remediation. So generally there's 5 stages to the CTEM type program. So you just kind of scope out what are your assets, where are your exposures, what's your attack surface, what's your cloud posture, what's your digital risk in the external environment, and all that thing feeds into a discovery around what actually you have. Then you look into what your vulnerabilities are and what your exposures are. You do prioritization, then you do validation, and finally you mobilize, and you do that in a continuous cycle, so that you are always expanding out your scope of what you're trying to manage from an exposure management perspective. So if you're thinking about something kind of to think about, and this isn't exactly the same for every organization, but there are maturity dimensions for threat exposure management. So one is the scope of coverage of your assets. So foundationally, you need to be, covering your IT environment as much as you can. As you get into the mature stage, you'll be thinking about making sure there's no rogue assets or new assets popping up that are unmanaged or unconfigured. Then you've got OT, IoT as you move up the advanced scale. Obviously, if you're heavy into the OT environment where that's your main business, then you might flip that around. Then you've got the exposure scope, maturity dimensions. So foundationally, you need to be thinking about misconfigurations, vulnerabilities, security awareness of your people. But then as you get more mature, yeah, you're into privileged identity management and all identities, security, cloud security posture management, open, deep, and dark web, and then getting into more advanced exposure considerations around the likes of the understanding the exposures within the complete supply chain, brand abuse, and VIP targeting and things like that. And then in terms of the management process dimension for maturity, you're starting out with your vulnerability management, risk-based prioritization. But as you get more mature, you're into external attack surface management and cyber asset attack surface. And all of that entails around cybersecurity testing, vulnerability management, pen testing. As you get more mature, continuous controls testing, advanced red teaming type exercises, and into continuous threat exposure management. So as I said, this won't be the same for every organization. It does depend on your profile, but I think it's worthwhile in that early stage of a C10 program to start scoping out, well, where am I on this maturity curve across these 3 dimensions? Where do I need to get to? And then instigate programs to help you move yourself up the maturity curve. Because that should be ultimately the goal, is to build that maturity over time. Lots of benefits then, so I'm just going to wrap up now in a moment, but the benefits are clear. I mean, it's about reducing risk. So bad actors will try and leverage any exposure. So therefore, you as a defender need to think about all your exposures in order to manage that risk. Resilience is a theme of today. So it does enhance your resilience, makes you more resilient to attack, makes you more prepared for responding to threats when they do occur. It also helps you prioritize and therefore optimize cost. Helps with the prioritization and helps you continuously improve to move up that maturity curve that I talked about just a moment ago. According to Gartner, organizations who do implement continuous exposure management are 3 times less likely to suffer a breach. So there is some analyst support for this concept of investing in this way of working. So I think really just to summarize, attackers chain exposures. They'll use any exposure they can get to achieve their aims. So we need to expand that concept beyond just vulnerabilities. Understanding the attack surface is critical, both externally facing and the internal attack surface. Analysing the attack paths then within your environment to see how that might be navigated is important. And consider implementing a continuous threat exposure management platform. Then hopefully, instead of you end up as become a CEO, and you won't end up burnt like the chicken in the first picture. Thank you very much.